really, I think, the last surge of infection and the last wave of the pandemic that we need to deal with. Doesn't mean coronavirus is going to go away, but this is going to become a much more manageable threat after we get through this period. But this is the most difficult period, probably over the next 6 weeks right now. And the decisions that we make over the next 2 weeks are really going to decide what January looks like. I think depending on what we do over the next 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks, the outcome here is largely going to be baked in because there is a lag between our policy decisions and having an effect on the virus.
Mm-hmm. So based on the trends and the data, you see a peak probably right around the inauguration, and then walk us through what you think 2021 might look like in terms of vaccine rollout and some sort of return to normalcy.
Yeah, well, I'm optimistic about 2021. Some people, I think there's some disagreement here how quickly things will get better. I think things will get better very quickly, in part because we will have infected probably 100 million Americans by the end of January, in part because we're going to start rolling out a vaccine that seems to be very effective based on the initial clinical studies at preventing COVID disease and perhaps preventing coronavirus infection, although we don't know the answer to that question yet, whether it just prevents disease or also prevents infection. But I think as we get into probably February and certainly into March, I think you're likely to see the virus largely collapse. And I think that we're going to enter a period of time over the spring and the summer when it's going to be relatively quiescent. We'll see cases get reported, but we're not going to see major spread. There'll be sporadic outbreaks. I fully expect kids will be back in summer camp and people will be having barbecues again outdoors. I think we're going to do things a little bit more carefully. People just aren't going to snap back in terms of their behavior. We spent a year socializing ourselves to, avoid gatherings and wear masks and not go into public places that are crowded. And we're not just going to be able to snap back. We've kind of conditioned ourselves to certain behaviors. But I would expect that coronavirus is going to largely stop circulating, in part because we're going to be deploying a vaccine over this time period, and in part because a lot of people will have had this infection. We'll probably have infected 30% of the public by the end of January with COVID. Right now, we're probably somewhere between 15 and 20% in terms of the total number of people around the country that have been infected. And when you look at states like South Dakota and North Dakota, at least 35% of those populations have been infected, maybe upwards of 50%. So you get to a point where you don't achieve what people refer to as herd immunity. And I'm not sure we're ever going to get herd immunity with this virus because you don't get what we call sterilizing immunity. It's not the kind of virus where if you get it once, you never get it again. So it's still going to circulate. But you get to a level of background immunity in the general population that it doesn't circulate nearly as readily because most of the people who are vulnerable to getting the infection and spreading the infection will have either gotten it already by the spring or will hopefully get vaccinated. In terms of the vaccine itself, we are going to be supply constrained for a period of time. And as you know, I'm on the board of Pfizer, which is one of the companies that has a vaccine in advanced development that's going to be reviewed by the FDA this week. So the companies combined have said, Pfizer and Moderna, which are the two companies that could have vaccines that are authorized in the very near future, they have said that there will be 40 million doses available in the month of December, or the government said there's 50 million doses available in the month of January, and 60 million doses available in February and March. And so it's a 2-dose vaccine, so 40 million doses is enough to vaccinate 20 million people. So you're going to work through that supply. That's going to be rationed. There's going to be schemes that are promulgated about who gets it first and second and third. It's very clear that the first people to get it are going to be healthcare workers and elderly people who live in congregate settings, so nursing home and long-term care facilities. And then there's some debate about what the next tranche of eligible people is going to be. This is going to feel to most Americans like a difficult process for a period of time because it's going to be rationed. Demand's clearly going to outstrip supply. People are going to be worried about where they fall on that list. I think we're going to see an inflection point here at some point in the spring where all of a sudden a commodity that was very scarce and hard to get is at some point going to become much more plentiful and it will be more widely available. And I don't know where that inflection point is when supply is suddenly going to really come online, But my guess is it's going to be sometime around March that all of a sudden we're going to see that there's a lot more vaccine in the market, and what seemed like a scarce commodity that was being very tightly rationed will suddenly become more generally available to most Americans. So I think to the extent that a lot of Americans are going to feel a degree of understandable anxiety about when they could get vaccinated, where they fall on that list over the next couple of months, I think we're going to get to a point in time, relatively soon, when it's going to be generally available to most people, and probably licensed, hopefully, if things go well and data continues to demonstrate that these vaccines are safe and effective, licensed at some point in the summer for widespread availability.
So there's worldwide demand for the vaccine, not just in the U.S. How does Pfizer decide how much to give the U.S., the U.K., the other countries that are clamoring for it?
Yeah, well, largely 50-50. I mean, the production, Pfizer's production is split across two facilities, one in Europe and one in the United States. I mean, there's multiple facilities involved in the supply chain, but in terms of fill finishing and major production, they've split their production between the U.S. and ex-U.S., and the ex-U.S. facilities are supplying overseas markets. Companies said that they'll have 1.3 billion doses next year. So there's going to be a significant amount of supply available coming into the market next year. And that's going to be distributed both here in the US as well as internationally. Within 24 hours, almost immediately, when the United Kingdom authorized the vaccine last week, there were trucks, Pfizer trucks, rolling into the United Kingdom through the channel, delivering supplies into the UK. And so those vaccines are pre-positioned right now. The UK said they're going to start to vaccinate as early as tomorrow and maybe vaccinate upwards of 800,000 people this week. Same thing's going to happen in the US. As soon as the company gets the authorization from the government that this vaccine is authorized to be made available, it will be shipped immediately to locations that have already been predetermined as vaccine distribution points. And so it will be immediately available. And the other point that I'll just make is the supply that's been talked about for December, at least as far as Pfizer is concerned. I don't know what Moderna's plans are, but that's largely been manufactured. So when the company said they'll have 50 million doses available in December, 25 million for the US, 25 million for the ex-US markets, most of those doses have already been manufactured and are ready to go. So there shouldn't be any issue with getting that supply available for December.
Okay, I'm going to hand off to our editor-in-chief, Nicole Carroll.
You mentioned the supply constraints, and there'll be 40 million doses. I've read some discussion over, is it better to give 20 million people 2 doses or get all 40 million out there and then catch up to the second dose as supply catches up? What's the best strategy?
Well, look, I feel very strongly that we should get as many shots in arms as possible right away. The reality is that one dose is partially protective. Depending on what age you are, it might be more or less protective. So by giving one dose, you are affording people some protection. And the idea that we need to, cut it in half and give half of it now and hold on to it so we have supply in January to give the second dose, I just fundamentally disagree with that, because the reality is supply ramps very quickly in 2021. If something happened and we didn't have supply available in 2021 to give everyone who got the first dose in December their second dose, we're going to, quite frankly, have bigger issues, because it's going to mean that there was something that went wrong with manufacturing, and we're not going to have enough supply for January and February and perhaps March. So, I don't think we should be holding on to supply now, anticipating that something goes wrong that's going to cause a lot of other challenges. I think we should be taking some risk. This is an environment where there's a widespread pandemic causing immediate death and disease. This is the type of environment where you take some risk and try to get as many doses out as possible in December, recognizing that, frankly, this is going to be over in a couple months. I mean, what we do right now is going to determine how many lives we can save. Holding on to a shot now so we can give it by the end of January, when this epidemic and this pandemic across the US has largely run its course and is starting to decline, that fundamentally doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I think we need to get as much protection in as many arms as possible right now, assuming that these vaccines are demonstrated to be safe and effective by FDA, which I believe they will be, but FDA needs to ultimately make that determination. and we'll have an answer from the agency probably in a very short period of time. But if FDA comes to that determination, I think you want to maximize the availability of this and maximize the protection. And the way to do that is to get as many shots in arms as possible during the acute phase of this, which is really the next 6 weeks.
Who ultimately will make that decision?
Well, it's going to be HHS. It's going to be Monsef, who's head of Operation Warp Speed, and some of the logistics people who are managing that. And they seem to be heading in the direction of making the decision that they're going to hold on to some supply and not deploy all the vaccines in December. But, I think it would be a shame to have stockpiled vaccine in December so you can have it on the shelf in end of January, right as this epidemic has run its course. And we're starting to see declines in the number of daily new cases. And, we've seen these epidemic curves before. They are a sharp up and they are a sharp trip down. There will come a point sometime in January, probably mid-January, maybe earlier January, where new daily cases are starting to decline very rapidly. And it's in part going to be because of policy responses and people just taking more precautions in their daily lives as they see news of the virus spreading and causing more death and disease. It's going to be partly a consequence of the fact that a lot of people who are vulnerable to the infection will have had it. And it'll be partly a consequence, a little bit, to the fact that we're going to be vaccinating people, and that's going to provide another layer of protective immunity on a narrow portion of the population. But at some point in January, this virus is going to start to decline very rapidly. And if we've stockpiled vaccines that we could have given to people who could have benefited from that in December, so that we could have it sitting on the shelf right at the time that the virus is declining, I don't see the public health. I don't see us maximizing the public health utility of this product that way.
Thank you.
Executive Editor.
Hi, thanks for being with us. What do you think the second half of 2021 begins to look like in terms of life for people in this country? Very much like it is now, or do you think we see some gradual return to a more normal way of living?
Yeah, nothing like what it is now. I mean, I think we talk about a new normal. I think that we're going to have to be more vigilant about the spread of respiratory pathogens in the winter. And we are oddly and unfortunately far too complacent historically about flu. And we let flu infect and kill far too many people. So I think that we're going to need to be more vigilant, not just about flu, but about coronavirus, because it's still going to circulate. It's still going to infect some people, and some people are still going to die from it. But we're going to have a vaccine. We're going to have therapeutics that could rescue people who become infected and are high risk of having a bad outcome. The therapeutic antibodies look very effective and will be more widely available in 2021. So I think fall of 2021, what happens next year, in my view, is that we have a very dense epidemic this winter. We go through a very terrible time period. This starts to dissipate some point in end of January, February. We have a spring and summer that's relatively quiet, in part, again, because we've gone through this epidemic and we're starting to vaccinate people, in part because there is a seasonal backstop. This isn't going to spread as readily in the spring and the summer when we're moving outdoors. And then as we head into the fall, we face renewed risk that there's going to be outbreaks, not an epidemic on the scale of what we're going through now, because there's going to be a higher rate of exposure and background immunity in the population, but certainly a risk that it could spread in the winter. But at that point, hopefully there's vaccines that are widely available and generally available. We'll be vaccinating the population for this before the fall COVID season. And we'll go into the winter with a population that's largely protected, has immunity. And so while it will spread, it'll spread far less. And if the vaccines do continue to demonstrate the safety and efficacy that they've shown in the initial trials, and again, I want to remind people I'm on the board of Pfizer, which is one of the companies with the vaccine. A 95% effective vaccine is very effective. Flu vaccine typically will only be about 40% effective in a given year, maybe a little bit more, some seasons a little bit less. A year ago, the flu vaccine wasn't very effective. It was only about 35 or 38% effective. So we have a 95% effective vaccine that's largely safe. That's going to be very protective for the general population. So I think we go into the next COVID season, the winter, with this being a risk, a nuisance, something that changes how we do certain things. We don't crowd 30 people into a small conference room. We don't want to get in elevators that are overpacked. Maybe there's fever guns outside of stadiums, and we're still, doing symptom questionnaires in certain settings. And, if you're sick, you're strongly discouraged not to come into work. Whereas sometimes people tough out a cold. Nobody will be allowed to tough out a cold in school or at work. They'll be sent home. So there's things we're going to do differently. But I will say, from a public health standpoint, and even from a business standpoint, I think that we're going to pick up a lot of benefits of that behavior in terms of improved productivity and improved health, but improved productivity, because we're going to see far less flu incidents. One thing that we've observed in this pandemic is that while the mitigation steps that we're taking are effective at reducing the spread of COVID, they're extremely effective at reducing the spread of flu. And we've seen that globally, and we're seeing that in the US right now. And remember, these mitigation steps, the social distancing, the mask wearing, all of the things we're doing, these were really designed as a way to stop a flu pandemic. They weren't designed with coronavirus in mind. And so they seem to be much more effective at breaking chains of transmission of flu than even breaking chains of transmission of COVID. So whatever we do to try to prevent COVID, or at least mitigate the risk of COVID, we're probably going to see in terms of sharply decreased rates of flu, which are going to have a very direct payoff in terms of not just improved health, but actually productivity gains. And so, final point is a long way of saying, we're businesses that invest in trying to create conditions that are safer for the spread of respiratory pathogens, that reduce the spread of respiratory pathogens in the wintertime. I think there's going to be a very direct economic payoff for that in terms of improved productivity of their workforce if they make those investments, which I think they're going to have to make those investments.
Thank you.
A return to large events like concerts, sports with people in the stadiums, big weddings, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I think that we're going to see venues in the summertime, and then we're going to have to, make a determination about the fall and the winter when there's more risk of spread, and there will be more spread of this. But I think if you have a vaccine that continues to demonstrate the profile that these vaccines have shown, that's widely accessible and largely used. And you don't need to vaccinate 80% of the public. I mean, if you get to 50%, that's going to be a pretty effective target. Anything above that, I think, is just sort of additional benefit. But if you have a vaccine that's effective, that's widely deployed, a population that's seen the virus, it's circulated through the population, I think we'll return to gatherings and indoor gatherings next year. I think that there's going to be some precautions taken. I don't think that we're going to do things next year like we did in 2018, but I think that there's going to be precautions taken for an extended period of time. I think that we have more awareness about the spread of respiratory pathogens. I mean, who's going to a meeting and shaking 30 hands again? I think customs are going to change a little bit. I think you're going to see masks more generally worn in airports and public transportation, and it's not going to be something that's objectified or looked upon strangely. I think that we're just going to do some things differently societally, just like after other periods of time when we've had major events, it changed our behavior for a period of time. I think the same thing's going to happen here. And I'll just say, final point: after SARS hit Asia in 2002, 2003. There's a lot of things that changed in terms of their government structures, how they responded, things they put in place, but also how they behaved, how they took precautions in the wintertime around the spread of respiratory disease. And so I think that we're likely to see the same thing here. We just changed certain customs. That doesn't mean we're not going to have indoor venues. I just think we might have indoor venues differently. The idea that as we walk into a public venue, there's fever guns or infrared scanners, I wouldn't be surprised to see that. I think it's going to be much harder in the future to get across a public threshold with a fever than it's been in the past.
Okay, two of our health reporters, Karen and Ken, are on the call. Let me give them a chance.
Hi, you just mentioned that you think only 50% of the public needs to take a vaccine in order for it to be effective. Do you think that where we are today, that 50% will take it? And if not, what do you think Pfizer and the FDA should be doing right now to build public
Yeah,
trust.
I don't know where the exact number breaks down. There's probably a lot of good epidemiologists doing some analysis of what the right number is. And partly it's going to depend on what we learn about the vaccine. Does the vaccine just prevent signs and symptoms of COVID, or is it actually preventing infection, or is it reducing someone's likelihood of spreading the infection? And I have personal views on that, but it's conjecture. All these trials have demonstrated so far is the vaccines sharply reduce the incidence of COVID disease. They have not proven yet that they reduce the incidence of coronavirus infection, and they haven't proven yet that they reduce someone's likelihood of shedding the infection. Now, again, I can, sort of speculate what I think is going to be shown, but we need to actually prove it. And depending on where those questions fall out, what the answers are, that's going to influence how many people you need to vaccinate in order to achieve a level of immunity that the vaccine itself really stops the circulation of the virus. But we're not vaccinating a naive population. We're vaccinating a population that's going to have had a lot of coronavirus. So, the idea that we need to vaccinate 60% of the population to really achieve a level of immunity that's going to reduce spread of disease, 30% of the public's going to have had this. That I don't think that by the end of January, I don't think that that's an outrageous estimate. I think if you look at the models right now, it's between 15 and 20% of the public that's already had coronavirus, and that's going to increase over the next 4 to 6 weeks. So we're vaccinating a public that's already been exposed to this. And while you're going to vaccinate some people that have already had the infection, you're going to be vaccinating a lot of people that haven't had the infection as well. And so, the vaccine is going to be an incremental level of protection in the population on top of people who already have developed some innate immunity. In terms of how to inspire public confidence, I think that we need to be doing everything we can to collect data post-approval or post-authorization of these vaccines, assuming that you are authorized by the FDA in the near future, to continue to learn about the safety profile of these vaccines and also answer these questions about what is the true benefit. Is it preventing infection? Is it preventing viral shedding? I wrote an op-ed with Mark McClellan, former FDA commissioner, who I had worked for at the FDA years ago, arguing that we needed to put in place a very aggressive post-market data collection scheme to try to monitor the performance of these vaccines in the post-market. So that's going to be very important. I think it's going to be important to get some people to vaccinate themselves publicly to assure the public of their confidence in the vaccine. I mean, I know the former presidents have talked about getting vaccinated in public. I think trying to find a few celebrities and a few influencers, people who other individuals trust, get them vaccinated early, get them vaccinated on TV, I think is going to be important. I used to always get my flu vaccine on TV every year. I felt it was important that the FDA commissioner get vaccinated publicly for flu. So people saw me getting vaccinated and saw me expressing my confidence in the vaccine. I think that we're going to need to do things like that with this vaccine. We should think about that and who those individuals are and where we do that and how we do that. I've heard a couple of people, when I suggest this, a couple of people said to me, well, that's not fair. They're jumping the line. They're not in the queue to get vaccinated. I think the public health and the public interest is very well served if we could find some people who are willing to, step out and make a public statement and vaccinate themselves regardless of where they fall in the queue. And I would put the former presidents at the top of the list and probably some other, social media influencers and celebrities whose names I don't know because I'm not very culturally astute anymore.
Hi, Commissioner. Thanks for your time. There's been a lot of talk about the use of at-home rapid antigen tests, tests that don't need to be sent to a lab and can be used free of a healthcare provider as being a key to tracking the infectious phase of COVID. Do you think there's a role for these tests? And if so, is there anything that the FDA can do above and beyond what it's already done to get these tests to market?
Yeah, look, I think there's absolutely a role for these tests. From a regulatory standpoint and public health standpoint, I mean, one of the considerations that FDA is probably grappling with and struggling with is, number one, do you require some process for reporting the result of these tests? So if people are going to be diagnosing themselves at home, this is a reportable pathogen. Do you require some mechanism that the result has to get reported to a public health authority? And the second thing you worry about with an antigen test, an at-home test, or even a point-of-care diagnostic is that a lot of these tests are not as sensitive and specific as a PCR-based test. So you're going to miss infections. So you're going to tell people they don't have the infection when they really do. And you're also going to have some false positives. You're going to tell people they do have the infection when they really don't. And from a public health standpoint, you need to ask yourself, are you doing sometimes more harm than good by having a test that isn't 100% sensitive and specific, or is going to have some false negatives? It's going to tell people they don't have the infection when they really do. Because what could happen is if you have a test that has a lot of false negatives and tells people they don't have COVID, if they're not feeling well, they say, I don't have coronavirus. That means I can go visit my grandparents. I can go out. I can go to school. I can go to work because I have a negative test. And now they're going to do things that they might not otherwise have done, where they're going to put other people at risk because of that negative result. So you're changing behavior with that negative result. And that's why, from a public health standpoint, you worry about deploying outside of a medical setting where it can be supervised by a physician, a test that isn't very sensitive and very specific. Now, some of these point-of-care tests are getting pretty good, so they don't miss as many cases, but they're all going to miss some because a lot of it deals with sample prep and the type of sample you get. And that's going to be highly variable once you push a test out into the hands of a lot of consumers. So you got to ask yourself if you're doing more harm than good. I think in the setting of a pandemic like this, if you have a test that's otherwise pretty good, pretty sensitive, pretty specific, I think on the whole, as long as you can properly educate consumers, you're probably going to do more good than harm, even with a test that's going to miss some cases. And it's really dependent upon how well you educate people, because what you need to tell people is that if you have a test and you use it at home, but you really think you're not feeling well and you might have COVID, you got to go in and get a confirmatory test. You can't just rely on that result. So, you need to make sure people are properly educated and going to do the right thing with the test and the test result. But that is the public health question, whether or not deploying a test for at-home use outside of medical supervision, where people might not follow up, where you're going to have some false negatives, where you're going to tell people they don't have COVID when they really do, whether or not you're going to be creating behaviors that go on to actually spread more infection versus reduce the spread of infection. And that's the difficult question for regulators. That's a difficult public health question. My personal view is that the test is pretty good, pretty sensitive and specific. On the whole, in a setting like the one we're in right now, you're probably going to be doing more good than harm by deploying it. But it really is going to depend on the test you're using and how you're educating people about using it.
Thank you. Can I have one quick follow-up? Do you think the window is closing for these types of testing with the vaccine being rolled out soon? Will there be less need for this type of testing?
I don't think that there's going to be less need for this kind of testing. I think that we're going to be in a much different world in the future, where if you believe my thesis that we're going to have to manage respiratory disease in the wintertime more aggressively and be more vigilant about the spread of respiratory pathogens, I think that's also going to mean we have to have different kinds of diagnostic tests, and we need to deploy them differently. And that might mean having point of at home or easy to use at work platforms that allow you to screen yourself simultaneously for flu and coronavirus, so we can get people diagnosed more readily. Because if we're going to ask the public to be more vigilant and more aware, and we're going to use, we're going to be sort of telling people to stay home or sending them home if they look like they don't feel well, we need to have diagnostics deployed pretty readily. So I think we're going to be looking to use diagnostics differently as sort of routine screening in the future, because we're going to be much more aggressive about just making sure that we're not quietly spreading respiratory diseases in congregate settings. And remember, there's a fair degree of asymptomatic spread of flu as well. About anywhere from 15 to 20%, depending on the studies you look at, of flu is asymptomatic, where people are infectious with influenza and capable of spreading it, but they're not manifesting any symptoms. So it's not just coronavirus where you get asymptomatic spread, where you want to get people diagnosed. It's also flu as well.
We have Greg, Suzette, and Kelsey on from the editorial board. Greg?
Yeah, Doctor, thanks for talking with us. I was going over some of your comments over the last couple of months. You've been as prescient as anybody, more so than most, about where this is going. But even in your case, you were talking about back in October, you were remarking about how we were approaching 100,000 and that, but you thought it would definitely get much worse and peak perhaps sometime after Thanksgiving. And of course, as it turns out now, I think you're talking about peaking sometime in January, and the numbers were approaching 300,000. And I think you recently thought that we could get to 4,000 deaths a day. I guess my question is, you knew what was coming as much or better than anybody else. Did this unfold in a worse way than you anticipated? I mean, is this more severe than you thought? And I think back then you were predicting that, there would be policy changes as it grew more severe and people would change their behavior, and this would lead to a peak sometime after Thanksgiving. But we've had some policy changes. I think people have changed their behaviors. Is the virus turned out to be more severe than you anticipated, or the experts anticipated? Did it change in some way? I mean,
yeah,
why
I mean, I
is it
don't
so
remember
bad?
the exact statement that you're referencing. My presumption back in the fall was that this would peak sometime in December. I think it's extending longer, and the peak's going to be larger than we anticipated. In large part because we haven't taken any real policy response. When you think about these kinds of epidemics, you always expect there to be a compensatory change in behavior and policy. As things get worse, people start to stay home more, they wear masks more, businesses, take more precautions, policymakers step in. I think that the sort of response to this has been much slower than I would have anticipated. And so you're seeing an epidemic that's now going to peak larger than what we would have thought maybe 2 months ago. The other part of this that I think was unanticipated was the big wave of infection in the summer. And I think what many of us didn't necessarily see was that in the South, people would be going indoors to get the benefit of air conditioning in the summertime and going into congregate settings, into high-risk settings, and that you would see that big wave of infection that swept Texas and Arizona and Florida. That was unanticipated. And so, we were in a situation unlike Europe. I mean, Europe had a big epidemic in the spring. They had a relatively quiescent summer as they all went to, the sort of countryside in the summertime, and same with Sweden. I mean, Sweden, people leave Stockholm and they go into the countryside. And so, they're dispersed, they're outdoors, and then they came back in the fall and the infection started to spread again. I think what was different about the United States is we had the big wave in the springtime. People did go outdoors, things did get better, but then in the really hot climates, people went indoors again, into settings where you had air conditioners that were conducive to spread. And so we had a big wave of infection. So we never really had a period of time where there wasn't a lot of infection somewhere in the United States. And that set us up for a much more dangerous fall, where the country was already heavily seeded by the time we entered the difficult period. And then you had Sturgis in the Midwest, which was a super spreading event. And so the Midwest got very heavily seeded, and now you have sort of infection everywhere. It's really a confluent epidemic across the whole United States.
Yeah, one quick follow-up. I noticed you also talked some weeks ago about when President Trump was being treated and he received that cocktail and some medications that are widely available today. I think you expressed some concern that whether those are going to be manufactured in the amounts that would allow other people to receive them in a way that the president promised all would get the same medicine. I don't know that they are widely available still to this day. Is it possible that there is a two-tier system, some degree, that there are some people who have access to very specialized kinds of medication combinations that do help them get through this better than, and others
Well, I think
don't
with the
have that
antibodies,
access?
the antibodies are definitely being rationed right now, and they're not widely accessible. And so, where you present for care and how aggressive your physician is at advocating for you is going to probably impact on the margins, your ability to get access to those drugs. Unfortunately, these didn't need to be in short supply. There were many of us, including myself, that were writing and advocating back in April and May that we should start trying to requisition biologics manufacturing capacity, recognizing that the antibodies were going to be available at some point in the fall. They were the most likely therapeutic to be available that would have an impact on disease. And we didn't have enough manufacturing capacity for them. And this was a foreseeable problem. I mean, there's things we could still do now to try to increase manufacturing capacity, have more of these drugs heading into next year. We just didn't do them. I mean, the companies themselves went through a lot of steps, really extraordinary steps to increase their manufacturing capacity. Regeneron and Lilly literally moved products that they manufactured in the U.S. out of the U.S. Big commercial products. Took a lot of risk in doing that to free up all of their domestic manufacturing capacity just to make these antibody drugs. But ultimately, we needed to have the government step in and try to pay some companies probably to turn over their manufacturing capacity for other drugs to the U.S. government to manufacture these antibodies, and also potentially build new facilities. I mean, building a facility, biologic facility, would typically take 2 years. If you really crash it, maybe you can get it done in a year. If we would have started this right at the outset in March or April, there's a chance we could have had some facilities coming online right now if we really would have put a concerted effort into doing this, and it would have made a difference. So these didn't need to be in short supply. I think we need to rethink in the future how we approach these kinds of problems, because there's things we could have done here. But your question, there is, I think, an element of truthfulness in the fact that where you go, who your doctor is, how strongly they advocate for you is going to have some impact on your ability to get access to these scarce antibodies, at least over the next couple of months while they're still in short supply. Once again, like the vaccine, supply ramps very quickly for these antibodies, and I think as we get into 2021, there'll be ample supply at some point in 2021.
Okay, Suzette Gelsey.
Hi, doctor. Thank you for joining us. I'm wondering how confident you are as far as America's health systems being prepared to deploy the vaccines, particularly when you think about the storage and the extreme temperatures and such that are needed.
Yeah, I think that this is eminently manageable. I don't think that this is going to be the real obstacle. There's packaging that's been created. Pfizer, the company I'm on the board of, has created special packaging for these vaccines that allows them to be stored on site in dry ice for a period of days. Once you open it, these come in pallets of about 100 vaccines, and so you should be able to distribute 100 vaccines in a day at any reasonably sized distribution site, including something like a CVS pharmacy. I don't think that the actual mechanics of the distribution is going to be the challenge. I think the bigger challenge is going to be, as long as we're in sort of this rationing phase, trying to apportion it equitably. So if we make decisions about which groups should be eligible for it, making sure we can actually find those individuals and verify their quote unquote eligibility. Even now, with respect to how we're distributing it, we're giving it to the healthcare institutions, inpatient facilities, to distribute it to healthcare workers, because the first tranche of patients who are going to get it are going to be people who are in institutional settings, elderly individuals in institutional settings like nursing homes, and healthcare workers. Okay, so you give a certain allocation to a hospital to vaccinate their doctors. Who does that include? Nurses certainly should get it. Doctors, which doctors? What about people who work in ancillary services who are also exposed to the virus? People who clean rooms, they should probably get it too. Those decisions are going to be made by the local institutions by and large. What about outpatient doctors that are disconnected from the hospital but are seeing a lot of COVID patients? Your local primary care provider who's on the front lines of coronavirus but doesn't have privileges at the hospital, so the hospital wouldn't distribute a vaccine to that individual, or a pediatrician. They might not get access to it because they're not part of the local hospital. So even within, something as simple as distributing a vaccine to healthcare providers through healthcare institutions, you're going to see a lot of heterogeneity in how those decisions get made and which healthcare providers and which people associated with healthcare delivery are getting vaccinated, not just not just between different states, but frankly within a state. So, I think that those are going to be the bigger challenges, how those allocation decisions get made. I think that the logistics of it, storing it, creating the injection sites, I think that's largely been worked out. I'm not saying it's going to go completely smoothly. Nothing goes completely smoothly, but there's been a lot of thought put into this. So I think that that's not going to be the bigger piece of the challenge here.
Good morning. Thank you. You mentioned that the virus will continue to circulate. How worried are you about the virus mutating each year like the flu? And do you think next winter we'll need a new version of vaccines?
I'm not that worried about it. This virus is going to drift, and there are going to be mutations. But the part of the virus that we use for developing the vaccine, all the manufacturers, including Pfizer, the company I'm affiliated with, are using as the quote unquote epitope, the part of the virus that is being used to stimulate the immune response, stimulate an antibody response, is the spike protein. And that's relatively conserved. I don't want to say that it's not undergoing some genetic change where the spike protein itself is changing a little bit. We've seen that, but the key components of it that your body develops antibodies against are relatively preserved. And so the idea that you're going to see a very rapid mutation that becomes the predominant form within one season that would just obviate the vaccine is unlikely. That doesn't mean that you wouldn't be reformulating the vaccine every 2 or 3 years to try to take a combination of how the virus itself has evolved over time. You probably will, but that should be a relatively straightforward feat because of the way these vaccines are made using the sequence strain. So I'm not worried about waking up one day and finding all of a sudden the vaccines don't work anymore. Keep in mind also, if you have a mutation, it's not enough just to have a mutation. The mutation has to become the predominant form. So it has to be a mutation that somehow makes the virus itself more likely to spread. And so it outcompetes, the mutated form outcompetes the sort of natural form or the prior form. And coronavirus itself is pretty contagious. And so coming up with a version that's more contagious and is going to rapidly outcompete the version that we know, it's just not going to happen quickly. With flu virus, the difference between the coronavirus and the flu virus is the coronavirus is a single segment of RNA. It's actually not a very complex virus. A flu virus is, if I remember correctly, 8 segments of RNA, 8 subunits. And so with the coronavirus, you get some genetic changes within that single segment. But the reason why flu mutates so rapidly is because you have 8 different subunits as part of the genetic sequence of the virus. And you don't just get changes within each of those subunits, but you get the different subunits swapping genes. And sometimes they don't just swap genes within the same virus, but 2 different viruses will come together in the same body and they'll trade genes. And so because of it's a subunited virus, you get more genetic heterogeneity with a flu and more rapid mutation than you do with a coronavirus.
With the coronavirus, there still seems to be a lot of confusion, at least among people I know, about airborne transmission versus surface transmission from things like packages or serving utensils or doorknobs. Can you tell us what we know and don't know on that subject?
Well, as far as the risk of what we call fomites, which is touching a contaminated surface and getting the virus, that seems to be far less of a risk than we initially thought. And that doesn't mean it's not a risk. You can still get the virus through touching contaminated surfaces and then rubbing your eyes. So good hand hygiene is still something that's simple and prudent. But it seems that most of the spread, certainly the majority of the spread, but maybe the vast majority of the spread is through droplet transmission and maybe some aerosolization of the virus. That seems to be the primary route of transmission with this virus. And we didn't necessarily think that early on. One of the reasons why the White House was very worried about epidemics in Detroit and Boston, obviously New York, was they were very worried about operating mass transit systems because they thought that a lot of spread was through contaminated surfaces. And so they were very worried about cities that had big mass transit systems that could be conduits of spread. That turned out not to be, it wasn't wrong, but it wasn't as much of a factor as we thought it would be. In terms of whether or not this spreads through droplet transmission or aerosolization, the difference there is that droplet transmission means that you have to be in contact with someone's moist droplets. So you have to be relatively close to them. Aerosolization means that those droplets can become evaporated, and you get what's called, in the old teaching, droplet nuclei. You basically get viral RNA, viral particles suspended in the air, and they can stay suspended for very long periods of time. So the classic virus that spreads through aerosolization is measles. Someone can walk through a room who has measles, and 2 hours later, you can walk into that room and catch measles because it stays suspended in the air for such a long length of time. We believe that coronavirus, COVID, is spread primarily through droplet transmission, not aerosolization. But we need to remember these things aren't binary. They exist on a continuum. So a virus that spreads predominantly through droplet transmission, under the right circumstances, will spread through a pattern of spread that could look a lot like aerosolization. So if you create just the right circumstances. So what are those? Maybe it's a tightly packed indoor setting that's got an air conditioner on that's blowing around the room with people talking loudly, where you get a lot of droplets and they evaporate quickly and they're blown around. So you could sort of create the right circumstances where something that would normally spread through a droplet pattern suddenly starts spreading through a pattern that looks like aerosolization. And that's probably what's happening here as well. And that's how you explain these sort of super spreading events at some of these indoor venues where you'll see like a church service or a conference or a restaurant where there'll be one infected person that we know of and 90 people will be infected. You probably had optimized conditions and a pattern of spread that started to look like aerosolization in those circumstances.
Yesterday, President-elect Biden announced his intention to nominate former Congressman Becerra for HHS Secretary. Under the circumstances, should he have picked someone with more of a public health and science background?
Yeah, look, I don't really have an opinion, to be perfectly frank. I don't know the congressman other than by reputation. I think HHS, having observed a number of secretaries, it's a big agency. You're running a lot of optives. It's got a significant budget, and so I think above all else, HHS is really a management challenge. It's a political job. It's a management job. And so I think having someone with a pedigree where they have political experience, where they have management experience, probably are the two most important variables. Public health experience is certainly important, being able to speak the language. But a lot of people who don't have a clinical background or don't come out of a deeply public health background can speak the language. And at the end of the day, you're going to have optiv heads, people who are running the operating division, CDC, FDA, CMS, who are much wonkier and more granular, as I was when I read FDA.
So would you be interested in serving in the Biden administration?
Yeah, look, I've had a couple of discussions with the transition team just to give them some advice. They've reached out to me. I've not had any discussions with the administration about any role. Look, I'm certainly available to help anyone. I talk to governors all the time on a bipartisan basis and members of Capitol Hill. I don't foresee a future in politics right now or serving in any kind of government capacity for myself. I really don't, but I'm available. I pick up the phone, I call people back, and I try to be helpful to whoever I can. And I've spent a lot of time talking to governors. I spent a lot of time talking to Lamont in my home state of Connecticut, who I think's done a very good job managing this, Murphy in New Jersey, Baker and Hogan, where I serve in their advisory committees. I talk to Raimondo in Rhode Island quite often, who I think's done an outstanding job in her state. Whitmer and Governor Whitmer in Michigan, I've talked to a number of times. So I've tried to make myself accessible to the governors and be helpful to the states.
In the remaining time left, I think Kelsey might have a couple of questions from our colleagues who've been observing but are not on the screen here.
You mentioned that the UK begins rolling out a vaccine shortly. How is it that they're able to roll it out so much faster than we are? And what lessons can we learn from them about handling COVID, but also diseases in the future. And related to that, based on some reporting, Australia was able to return to normal life after a mandatory nationwide lockdown that was left in place until the nation went 20 consecutive days with no new cases. Is that something we can or should do to help defeat COVID as the vaccine gets rolled out?
Well, keep in mind, Australia is in their summertime right now, and there is a seasonal component to this virus, and that seasonal component is going to become more prominent as time goes on. I mean, this is going to sort of migrate from being a pandemic strain that just spreads all the time to being a seasonal strain of coronavirus that only spreads in the season in which coronavirus is typically spread, which is really the winter. It's not even the fall, it's the winter. So I think as we get into 2021, this will adopt a more seasonal pattern. I think part of the reason why Australia doesn't have a lot of spread right now is because they've made difficult decisions, but they're also in their summertime. I don't know that we could have gotten to a point where there was no coronavirus here in the U.S. and that we could have extinguished this. This country was too diverse, too big, too non-compliant in some respects with some of the steps we would have had to take, and we weren't going to be able to get the kind of compliance that we needed. So we were always going to have spread. I think the difficult thing was what the point I made earlier was that we had a pretty big epidemic in the summer, and that kind of set us up for a worse fall. As far as the UK is concerned, they deployed the vaccine quickly once the authorization was given. We're going to deploy the vaccine quickly once an authorization is given here in the US. So I don't think there's any difference there. The difference was that they authorized it before we did. But we made deliberate decisions about our regulatory process for understandable reasons, for prudent reasons, that ultimately delayed the authorization of this vaccine by a matter of weeks, not months, but weeks. I mean, assuming it does get authorized at some point soon, and some people are speculating this week. I don't have any knowledge of that beyond what I read in the newspaper, but there are some people speculating that shortly after this advisory committee on the 10th, you'll see an authorization from FDA if things go well. Could that have happened 2, maybe 3 weeks earlier? It's possible, I think, but we made sort of commitments to a public advisory committee. I think there are sound reasons why the FDA did that. It provides a level of transparency and public assurance that I think is important. The FDA required 2 months of safety data on 50% of the patients in the trials before they would even accept an application from the sponsors. That delayed the filing probably by a couple of weeks. There's reasons why they did that. They wanted to have a robust safety database before they were going to evaluate and ultimately authorize these vaccines. It's a defensible decision on the part of the agency. But we should just acknowledge we made decisions to have a more rigorous regulatory review here and a more transparent and public process that delayed availability of the vaccine by a number of weeks, by 2, maybe at most 3 weeks. Now, in normal circumstances, that doesn't sound like a lot of time at all. In the circumstance we're in, obviously every week matters. And so, this is why people are asking questions about should we have done it a week earlier, a week later. I think ultimately the decisions that the FDA made, first of all, they're made. We're done. It's baked. It's done. We can't go on and ring that bell. But I think that they were prudent decisions. I think the agency was very thoughtful in the approach that they took here. So I think it's hard to retrospectively argue that anything was done that wasn't the right way to approach this.
The last question I have from people off screen is that you're insistent on inoculating as many people as soon as possible. Don't save the vaccines for later use. But the administration seems to be heading in a different direction. Do you have any avenues to influence this decision? And what do you think the chances that your view will prevail? And by the time Joe Biden is inaugurated, will it be too late to adopt that strategy?
Yeah, it'll be too late to adopt that strategy because this is a decision that is going to get made and play out over the month of December. I mean, this is a question of how many people do we get vaccinated in December. I think by January, once they have visibility on manufacturing and understand that hopefully there won't be any disruptions in manufacturing, they'll take a more aggressive posture about pushing out the vaccine. I think this is really born of probably some hesitation that they don't have full visibility into the manufacturing supply chain. Look, I don't have any more visibility than they do. They probably have more proximity to it than I do, notwithstanding the fact that I'm on the board of Pfizer. But number one, I have confidence that things will go well. And number two, I think in a circumstance like this, you need to have that confidence. You need to take a little bit of risk and hope things go well. Because if things don't go well, like I said at the outset, we're going to have bigger problems. It's not just going to be that we can't get everyone the second dose on time. It's going to be we can't get anyone new a first dose. And so, we need to kind of hope for the best and take a little bit of risk that things will work out well. I don't have any way to influence this other than speaking out publicly. I was on TV this morning, said the same thing, saying it very clearly here. I think it is a fundamental mistake to take vaccine and put it in a warehouse somewhere on a shelf when people could potentially be benefiting from it right now, knowing this is going to be over in 6 weeks. I mean, we have a acute period of time where we're going to see a lot of death and disease. And they've said as much. They said the next 6 weeks are going to be the hardest period in the history of America. So during the hardest period in the history of America, you're going to take some vaccine that could potentially be benefiting from some people and lock it in a drawer. Fundamentally, that doesn't make sense to me. So we'll see ultimately the decision they make. But that's my view. That's what I would be advocating if I was there. I'm not there. So all I can do is talk to you folks. And I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, Lisa said we had a hard stop at 10, so we appreciate your time and expertise as always, and for speaking with us, and have a safe and healthy holiday season for you.
Thanks for having me.